in ways most of us have never been taught. These were the Nephilim, mentioned briefly in the book of Genesis, described as the offspring of the sons of God and the daughters of men. But the story does not end there. The Ethiopian Bible, one of the oldest and most complete versions of Scripture, preserves details that the Western Bible does not, hidden histories that reveal a world far stranger, far more complex, and far more terrifying than we ever imagined. Picture a world where humans walked side by side with towering giants, some reaching heights that would make modern skyscrapers seem small in comparison. These were not mere myths. They were beings that inspired awe, fear, and even worship. Ancient texts suggest that the giants' sheer presence brought chaos and corruption, spreading both physical and moral devastation across civilizations. The earth was a place of conflict, where human societies struggled to survive amid beings whose strength and influence were beyond comprehension. And while much of this history was obscured over time, traces of it have survived in fragments, whispers preserved in texts that have been hidden or ignored for centuries. The Nephilim, as briefly mentioned in the Genesis account, are enigmatic. Who were the sons of God that came to earth, and why did they take human wives? What was the purpose of their extraordinary offspring? The Western Bible provides only a brief glimpse, leaving many questions unanswered. It speaks of giants, of human wickedness, and of divine judgment through the flood, but it does not explain the full extent of the giants' existence, their influence on human culture, or the moral corruption they introduced. This is where the Ethiopian Bible becomes critical. It preserves details lost in Western translations, offering a window into a world of lost knowledge and forbidden history. In imagining this pre-flood world, it is not hard to feel a sense of awe. How would humans have lived alongside beings of immense size and strength? How did they build civilizations, maintain societies, or even attempt to survive when giants roamed the earth with capabilities beyond human imagination? These questions are not idle speculation. They strike at the heart of our understanding of ancient history and the origins of human culture. The Ethiopian Bible paints a picture of a planet teeming with life in forms that challenge everything we think we know. It tells of beings who could not only alter the physical landscape, but also sway the spiritual and moral direction of humanity. The corruption they spread was profound, reaching into every corner of the human experience. Modern curiosity about giants and hidden histories is more than a fascination with the fantastical. Archaeological discoveries, ancient legends, and obscure manuscripts hint at truths that mainstream history has overlooked or dismissed. The stories preserved in the Ethiopian Bible serve as a bridge between the mythic and the historical, between what is remembered and what has been suppressed. They invite us to question not only the events of the distant past, but also the completeness of the records we rely upon today. Were the giants merely a metaphor, or were they a reality whose traces still echo through human history? These questions have captivated the minds of scholars and seekers alike, driving an ongoing quest to uncover what has been hidden for thousands of years. Imagine standing on the edge of a cliff in that ancient world, gazing across the vast landscapes where giants walked and humans struggled. The air would have been thick with tension and fear, a constant reminder that humanity was no longer the uncontested force on Earth. Civilizations were fragile, moral codes under siege, and every human choice carried consequences magnified by the presence of these towering beings. Yet even amidst fear, humans persisted, building, learning, and attempting to navigate a world that was anything but ordinary. It is this tension, the struggle of humanity against forces far greater than themselves, that gives the pre-flood story its enduring power. The Ethiopian Bible preserves these narratives, allowing us to glimpse the complex interplay of humans, giants, and divine oversight in a way no other text does. As we delve into these ancient accounts, it becomes clear that what has been left out of Western traditions is not merely detail, but entire dimensions of history. The Ethiopian Bible describes giants not just as physical marvels, but as agents of profound influence, spiritual, moral, and cultural. It hints at lessons about human responsibility, divine judgment, and the consequences of unchecked power. It challenges us to rethink what we know about the past and to consider how much has been obscured by time, translation, and selective preservation. The story of the giants is not just a story of size and strength. It is a story of humanity's struggle to maintain its integrity in a world where extraordinary forces were at play. The mysteries preserved in these texts call upon us to engage with history in a deeper, more inquisitive way. They remind us that the world of the past was neither simple nor easily understood. Every fragment, every verse, every mention of giants or the Nephilim is a clue to a broader narrative that has been largely forgotten. And as we uncover these stories, we are invited to reflect not only on ancient events, but on their implications for how we understand morality, human behavior, and divine intervention. The Ethiopian Bible challenges our assumptions, urging us to look beyond the familiar and consider the astonishing truths that have been hidden in plain sight for millennia. Bible says, subscribe to the channel and share with your friends to help us reach 10,000 subscribers. Support us financially via Super Thanks. Comment your name and city and tell us what time you are watching from. If you want the Complete Ethiopian Bible, 88 books, and Book of Enoch English, the link is in the description. Long before the biblical stories that most people in the West know about were written down, there was a tradition that kept more than what modern readers usually see. The Ethiopian Bible is one of the most complete and oldest versions of the Bible. It has between 81 and 88 books, depending on the tradition. This is a lot more than the 66 books that most people know about. These extra books don't just repeat things or add small details. They have whole stories, laws, prophecies, and histories that aren't found anywhere else. The richness of this text comes from the fact that it keeps stories that show how humans began, how they struggled with their spirituality, and how they interacted with beings that challenged the imagination, like the giants and Nephilim who lived on earth before the flood. The Ethiopian Bible, on the other hand, keeps a continuous thread of history that lets readers see a world that feels both old and very alive. Western translations often cut out or shorten some parts. There are big differences between the Ethiopian Bible and Western versions. Your Enoch Jubilees and the Book of Adam and Eve are just a few examples of books that tell stories that are missing or very short in more well-known texts. These works elaborate on events that influenced early humanity, encompassing the impact of spiritual entities, the moral degradation of humankind, and the difficulties of existence in a world disrupted by supernatural forces. They give explanations for things that the Western Bible only talks about briefly or in a metaphorical way, filling in the blanks that make people wonder what was lost or left out on purpose. These extra books make the canon longer and more detailed, giving us a unique look at biblical history and a better understanding of the early years of humanity. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church has been very important in keeping these texts safe. For hundreds of years, people carefully copied the manuscripts by hand, kept them safe in monasteries, and passed them down from generation to generation. This cultural dedication makes sure that what we have today is not just a religious text, but also a historical archive that gives us a glimpse into ancient civilizations, religious thought, and the way of thinking of the people who first put these texts together and revered them. The Ethiopian canon stayed very stable, keeping stories that go against common narratives and open doors to hidden histories. This is different from Western traditions that were heavily influenced by theology and politics. The Ethiopian Bible's credibility is linked to the careful research and spiritual dedication that kept it alive through hundreds of years of change and upheaval. The content of these additional books frequently explores domains perceived as taboo or obscure to mainstream audiences. They talk about how people and spiritual beings interacted in ways that make it seem like the world before the flood was much more complicated than most people think. The Book of Enoch tells the story of the Watchers, angels who came down to earth and had children who were giants. The Ethiopian tradition keeps these stories alive with great detail. These texts do not hesitate to examine the ramifications of these unions, the corruption they inflicted upon humanity, the moral decline, and the remarkable abilities possessed by these hybrid entities. These kinds of revelations suggest that Western translators either didn't know about or didn't pay attention to certain information. This gives us a different way to look at the beginnings of human civilization and divine intervention. Many of the stories in the Ethiopian Bible mix history, prophecy, and morality. They tell stories in a way that is rich in detail and makes you think, while also teaching moral and spiritual lessons. The stories about giants, for example, are never just physical descriptions. They also include stories about how people act, how God watches over them, and how the universe works. The Ethiopian canon shows that humanity's past is not just a series of events, but a living story that can help us understand human nature, the effects of choices, and how the spiritual and physical worlds interact. The text serves as both a historical account and a means for contemplation. Numerous scholars examining the Ethiopian Bible assert that its preservation of these texts offers context for certain obscure references in Western scripture. For example, the short mentions of giants and Nephilim in Genesis are expanded upon in great detail. The Ethiopian tradition documents not only their physical characteristics, but also their influence on human societies, the transformations they induced in the moral and spiritual fabric of the world, and the divine reactions to their presence. These stories imply that the giants were not outliers, but pivotal characters in the narrative of humanity's initial conflicts, influencing occurrences that led to the flood. The Western narrative only has pieces of the story without these texts, which means that a lot of it is either not told or not understood. The Ethiopian Bible offers a cultural and historical perspective on early civilizations in addition to its narrative content. It shows how the people who first passed it on saw things, including local histories, oral traditions, and theological insights that were unique to the area. This makes the text a window into a world where geography, society, and spirituality were all connected, and where the effects of beings like the Nephilim could be recorded with care and authority. The way these stories were kept shows that they were not meant to scare or entertain people, but to teach, warn, and guide them. They taught people about the dangers of unchecked power, moral failure, and human responsibility. In a world where divine and earthly forces met, the Ethiopian Bible questions what we think we know about the world before the flood. It makes us question what we think we know about the early history of humans, the interactions between people and supernatural beings, and the size of the events that shaped the ancient earth. The text lets us think about the full range of human experience before the flood by keeping these stories alive. This includes not only survival, but also the moral, spiritual, and social struggles that characterized a time when giants and other powerful beings ruled the world. The vivid details and deep stories make readers think about a world that is much bigger, stranger, and more complicated than what is usually shown in Western scripture. The Ethiopian Bible is a key to understanding the whole Nephilim story because it keeps hidden histories alive. It sheds light on the reasons for the flood, how bad people are, and how giants shape the world's moral and spiritual landscape. These accounts are not separate. They are linked to other biblical stories, creating a web of historical and theological knowledge that is worth studying closely. The text's depth lets readers see patterns, motivations, and consequences that would otherwise be missed. This shows how ancient history and divine oversight came together long before Noah's Ark carried people through the waters of judgment. In this context, the Ethiopian Bible is not just a religious book. It is also a storehouse of old knowledge that helps us understand what life was like before the flood. Its unique mix of canonical and extra-canonical books makes sure that the stories of giants, Nephilim and Watchers are preserved in detail. This gives modern readers access to information that was lost or hidden in other traditions. The text gives us a look into a world of huge beings, moral ambiguity, and divine involvement, connecting myth, history, and spiritual thought. By reading these stories, you can learn not only how big the giants were, but also how they changed the course of human history in the early days. Long before the floodwaters covered the earth, the pages of Genesis gave a short but creepy look at beings that went against the natural order. Genesis 6 talks about the Nephilim, the strange children of the sons of God and the daughters of men. The passage is short and almost secretive, but it has caused people to argue, wonder, and be afraid for hundreds of years. Who were these sons of God, and why did they hang out with people? Some people think they are fallen angels, while others think they are descendants of Seth. Everyone agrees, though, that their union produced extraordinary offspring, giants whose presence changed the fabric of human society. The mere mention of the Nephilim in Genesis stirs an unsettling awareness that humanity once coexisted with extraordinarily powerful entities, whose impact would resonate through generations. In Genesis, the sons of God are shown as divine or semi-divine beings who were not like normal people. Their union with human women was not merely an act of attraction. It constituted a transgression of boundaries, a fusion of celestial and terrestrial realms that yielded significant repercussions. People said that the Nephilim were powerful, famous men whose size, strength, and terrifying presence scared regular people. Imagine being in front of a creature that is 2 or 3 times your height and has the power to change the land, control animals, and make people obey just by being strong. For the people of that time, the giants were more than just a physical threat. They were a sign that divine laws and the natural order had been broken, and they were a moral and spiritual threat. People were afraid of the Nephilim for both practical and psychological reasons. People in these communities were always aware of these beings who could destroy settlements, scare people, and change the balance of power. The stories of giants walking among people are full of vivid images. Their presence cast shadows over whole valleys. Trampled crops, abandoned villages, and the cries of ordinary people were silenced by the sheer power of these huge beings. The bravest warriors were scared of fighting because they knew that strength alone might not be enough to stay alive. Their presence made people feel small, weak, and vulnerable, as if they were always on the verge of disaster. The Nephilim were more than just big people. They were living reminders of how fragile humans are and how dangerous it is to cross lines that shouldn't be crossed. This very unusual event caused a divine response, which changed the course of human history. Genesis says that the flood was not just a punishment, it was also a necessary step to bring things back into balance and get rid of the corruption that had spread across the earth. The Nephilim were a turning point in the world, a place where both physical and moral chaos were about to happen. The waters that covered the earth were a reset, giving people a chance to save their lives and get rid of the harmful effects of these hybrid beings. Noah, who was said to be righteous and without sin, was the one who carried out this divine plan, moving humanity forward while the giants and other bad things were swept away. The story shows the flood as both a historical event and a moral lesson, showing what happens when people cross divine boundaries and why order needs to be restored. But Genesis 6 is only a small part of the whole story. It gives us a taste of what happened, but doesn't answer all of our questions. It talks about the Nephilim and how scary they were, but it doesn't go into detail about how they affected the world or how morally complicated they made things. The Ethiopian Bible, on the other hand, suggests extra parts that the Western text doesn't have. These old manuscripts keep stories that add to what we know about the Nephilim's role, including how they interacted with people, how they influenced morality, and the spiritual problems they caused. Genesis is short, but the Ethiopian texts give more information about the world before the flood and the amazing forces that shaped it. The differences between the Western and Ethiopian stories are very clear. The Nephilim are mentioned in Genesis almost as an afterthought, a short break in the larger story of how people have become corrupt and how God has judged them. But the Ethiopian Bible says that their presence is important for understanding the early struggles of people. It talks about how the giants looked, how strong they were, and how they made human communities less stable. More importantly, it looks at the moral and spiritual effects of their existence, such as how they changed people's behavior, how they corrupted others, and how God tried to control their destructive power. The giants weren't just big people. They were the cause of a crisis that needed a response from God. These stories also help us understand why the Nephilim are so mysterious. Their existence fundamentally contests prevailing notions regarding human history and the constraints of terrestrial experience. They show a time when the lines between the divine and the human were crossed, when extraordinary power mixed with everyday life in ways that people could hardly understand. The Genesis story is short, so readers have to use their imaginations to fill in the blanks. The Ethiopian texts, on the other hand, help readers understand more about the story. They make it clear that the Nephilim were not just strange beings, but important people in a world where spiritual and physical interactions were very complicated. When we look at Genesis 6 in light of these other sources, it changes how we think about the time before the flood. The Nephilim story is no longer just about giants. It's now a complex story about divine order, human morality, and the effects of unusual unions. The Western Bible sets the stage by introducing the characters and the problem. The Ethiopian tradition builds on this by showing the full extent of the giants' presence, the fear they caused, and why the flood was necessary. This larger picture helps us see how deep the story is. We can see the Nephilim not only as beings with great physical strength, but also as agents whose actions needed divine correction. Looking at these stories next to each other makes it easier to see how much was lost or hidden in translation. The Western narrative, while canonical, provides merely fragments of a more extensive narrative. It doesn't help us understand the full extent of corruption, how giants and humans interacted, or the complicated moral landscape of the world before the flood. The Ethiopian texts, with their extra books and longer stories, keep these missing details, giving us a fuller and more interesting picture of early human history. They show that the Nephilim were very important in a world full of strange problems, moral quandaries, and divine oversight. This is a part of biblical history that has mostly gone unnoticed. So Genesis 6 is both a door and a puzzle. It talks about the Nephilim, hints at their scary power, and sets the stage for the flood as a way for God to step in. The Ethiopian Bible, on the other hand, is what lets us fully enter this ancient world, see the giants, and understand the complicated moral and spiritual effects of their existence. The story makes modern readers question what they think they know about early humans, how far divine justice goes, and the amazing forces that used to shape the earth. By connecting the short Genesis story with the more detailed Ethiopian tradition, the story of the Nephilim becomes more than just a historical curiosity. It becomes a deep reflection on power, morality, and the delicate balance between humanity and the forces that are beyond normal understanding. The Ethiopian Bible gives a much more detailed and broad picture of giants than Western scripture does. These beings were not just bigger people. They were amazing beings whose size alone made people feel awe and fear. Some stories say they were huge, at least 2 or 3 times the height of a normal man, and they had the strength to uproot trees, knock down houses, and bend iron with their bare hands. Their very presence changed the landscape, casting shadows over whole villages and making people feel like they were always in danger. People in villages and towns were always aware that these beings could show up at any time, and there didn't seem to be any way to protect themselves from their power. Their size and strength were only the beginning of what made them scary. What really scared people was how they combined being physically strong, smart, and morally indifferent. The giants were not only strong, they also brought corruption that went much deeper than the physical world. The Ethiopian texts say that their power reached into the spiritual and moral realms, making the hearts and minds of people around them corrupt. Communities that used to keep order and follow moral rules were swayed by fear or tempted to join forces with these powerful beings. The giants' presence messed up the way society worked, made justice less fair, and caused problems between families and clans. Those who fought back were not only in danger of being hurt, but also had to deal with the emotional toll of living in constant fear and trying to keep their faith and morals while being surrounded by forces that seemed to represent chaos itself. The giants stood for the moral decline of the world, a physical reminder that corruption could show up not only in people's actions, but also in the very beings who walked among them. People had strong and varied emotional reactions to the giants. Fear was always there, affecting daily life and choices, from the smallest tasks to the most important community events. Parents worried about their kids, warriors worried about their villages, and regular people lived with a constant sense of dread that affected everything they did. Along with fear came hopelessness and confusion. How could weak and limited humans fight beings that seemed to have no limits on their power? Some people tried to escape by moving from one settlement to another or hiding in forests or mountains, but they never felt safe. Some people turned to spiritual means for protection, asking God for help or using ancient rituals and sacred knowledge. The giants put humanity to the test, making people face not only the danger to their lives, but also how weak their moral and emotional strength was. The presence of the giants posed moral dilemmas that ordinary humans had never encountered. The Ethiopian Bible tells stories of times when communities were tempted to give up their values in exchange for temporary safety or favor from the giants. It was hard to do the right thing and uphold justice without putting yourself in danger of being killed because they were so powerful. Families and leaders were put to the test. Sometimes they made decisions based on fear, and other times they found courage that shocked those who saw it. The giants were more than just destructive forces. They were catalysts that showed people their strengths and weaknesses and put people and societies in crises that made them think deeply about their morals and spirituality. The giants were a spiritual challenge that was too big for people to understand. Their union with the sons of God had given them powers that normal people couldn't understand or fight against. The Ethiopian Bible makes it clear that these beings weren't just strong animals. They were beings whose very existence upset the balance between heaven and earth. Prophets and spiritual leaders had a hard time figuring out what their presence meant. They weren't sure if they were punishment, temptation, or a test of how strong humanity is. The stories show a world where the spiritual order was under attack, where divine justice, human morality, and extraordinary power clashed in ways that were both scary and life-changing. The giants had a huge impact on spiritual life, just like they did on physical life. This created a tension that changed the course of history before the flood. The giants caused a lot of physical damage, but the psychological and social effects on people were even worse. People lost hope and faith in an invisible way. Even though villages were abandoned, crops were ruined, and livestock were killed. Leaders lost their power, families broke up, and fear made communities unable to act. Even in areas that weren't directly involved in the fight, the stories of giants spread like shadows, changing people's behavior, morals, and culture. Every time people met these beings, they left a mark on their minds, teaching them lessons about humility, resilience, and the effects of living under the sway of extraordinary, morally ambiguous power. The Ethiopian Bible also talks about how the giants affected different generations. Kids grew up in places where fear was normal and stories of moral compromise and physical danger were common. These stories imply that humanity's conflict with giants was enduring, shaping entire societies and impacting traditions, laws, and cultural memory. The giants were important people in the world before the flood. They weren't just strange physical beings. They were also moral and spiritual tests. The Ethiopian texts preserve their legacy, which reminds readers that history is rarely made up of just human actions. Instead, extraordinary forces often interact with the ordinary, leaving lasting effects. The Ethiopian Bible gives us a unique look at the time before the flood by describing the giants in such great detail. It stresses that their role wasn't just about being strong physically. It also included being strong morally, emotionally, and spiritually. The stories show how people reacted with a mix of fear, bravery, compromise, and thoughtfulness, showing how extraordinary beings and ordinary people interact in a complicated way. The giants' presence tested humans in every way possible, showing how hard it was for early civilizations and how strong they had to be to survive. The Ethiopian Bible keeps a record of both physical and moral history through these stories. This lets modern readers picture a world where human limits were always being pushed by things they couldn't understand. The texts make it clear that the giants had a big effect on many things. They changed how people lived together, questioned moral and spiritual codes, and left behind a legacy of fear and awe that changed the course of history before the flood. The Ethiopian Bible doesn't just talk about physical fights. It also talks about what it's like to live under the shadow of beings with great power and questionable morals. The text makes sure that readers understand the full range of problems that existed before the flood, by focusing on both the physical and non-physical effects of the giants. This gives the story a depth that is often missing from other traditions. This approach paints a vivid picture of the early struggles of humanity, focusing on how strength, morality, and spiritual integrity worked together in a world where giants lived. Before the flood changed the world, there was a group of heavenly beings whose actions would change the course of human history forever. These angels, called the Watchers, came down from the heavens with plans that ranged from being curious to breaking the law. Their presence on earth caused waves that people could barely understand. The Watchers were different from other spiritual messengers in that they didn't just watch from a distance. They got very involved in the lives of men and women, forming relationships that made it hard to tell where the divine ended and the mortal began. Their choice to come down was not a random one. It was a deliberate choice to enter the human world, and the effects of that choice would last for generations. The Ethiopian Bible, along with the Book of Enoch, which is part of its canon, tells these stories in great detail and clarity. This is a record of interactions that Western scripture mostly leaves out or hides. The Watchers' most important actions were their marriages to human women, which led to the birth of a generation of giants called the Nephilim. These children were not like other children. They got their incredible strength, size, and intelligence from their heavenly ancestors. The giants were both awe-inspiring and scary because they had traits of both angels and humans. The Ethiopian texts paint a vivid picture of them. Their presence could change the landscape, their power could change the environment, and their influence could corrupt human society. These stories don't just tell simple stories about physical strength. They also talk about the moral and spiritual effects of their existence. People were fighting not only against terrible strength, but also against a corruption that spread through hearts, communities, and even whole civilizations. The giants were living proof that divine law had been broken. Corruption didn't just happen to the Watchers' physical children. These angels gave people knowledge that was not meant for them to have, teaching them things that were never meant for mortals to know. The Book of Enoch says that they taught people how to do magic, astrology, metalworking, and other arts that could be used for both good and bad. People used the gifts of knowledge in ways that made greed, violence, and moral decay worse, which was a high price to pay. What was supposed to be guidance turned into a source of temptation and rebellion. Fear, manipulation, and unnatural hierarchies, brought in by the giants and their angelic fathers, made villages and cities bigger and more complicated, but they also made them weaker. The world became a place of amazing abilities that were overshadowed by equally amazing corruption. The Watchers had a big impact on things that weren't just human. Their actions upset the natural and spiritual order, making things so bad that God had to step in. As the giants grew in number and human societies fought to keep them from spreading their power, it felt like the earth itself was shaking from the weight of this combined celestial and human force. Power was abused, rivers overflowed, fields were left empty, and the cries of regular people echoed in despair. The Ethiopian texts keep these stories alive in a way that makes them feel real, showing how big the crisis was and how hopeless life was for everyone. The Watchers' presence turned the world into a stage where moral, physical, and spiritual forces clashed in ways that made people question everything they thought they knew about the lines between God and man. The Ethiopian tradition goes into more detail about the Watchers' plans, actions, and final results than the Western Bible does, which only mentions the Nephilim briefly in Genesis 6. It gives names, family trees, and specific actions that show how much they affected others. Readers learn about the moral complexity of beings that are not completely good or bad, but whose choices have effects on humanity that can't be undone. By explaining how they taught forbidden knowledge, the Ethiopian texts show how their gifts had two sides. They made people smarter and more skilled, but they also made it much easier to destroy things. The giants and their angelic ancestors become key players in a story that mixes the spiritual, the moral, and the physical. This gives us a broad view of civilization before the flood that the Western canon doesn't give us. The Ethiopian Bible also talks a lot about how the Watchers are responsible, which is a theme that runs through the whole story. Even though they came from God, they still had to deal with the consequences. Their actions brought judgment not only on themselves, but also on their children and the corrupt human societies they affected. This story supports the idea that great power comes with great responsibility, which is also shown in the events that led to the flood. The giants and the Watchers are shown as forces that cause a moral reckoning, pushing people to the edge and forcing the divine to step in. Readers can see that the world before the flood wasn't just a random mess. It was built around the relationships between power, choice, and consequence. Humans also had a complicated reaction to the Watchers and their children. Fear, adaptation, and resistance all played a role in how communities lived. Some people tried to escape by hiding in the woods and mountains, trying to keep their morals and bodies intact. Others tried to survive by making deals with the giants or forming alliances. These strategies for survival were full of moral compromise, showing how hard it is to stay virtuous in a world where beings with extraordinary power rule. The Ethiopian Bible does not shy away from these problems. Instead, it makes them central to understanding what it means to be human at a time when divine laws were openly challenged and human agency was pushed to its limits. The Ethiopian tradition gives modern readers a lot of stories to work with, which helps them picture how big the world was before the flood. The giants' physical strength and the Watchers' spiritual knowledge made a society that is very different from the ones we live in today. In everyday life, people had to deal with a world of great power and moral ambiguity, where they were always reminded of how weak they were and what would happen if they broke the rules. These texts encourage readers to look beyond the surface of biblical references and see a world full of life, danger, and spiritual tension, where the line between human and divine, mortal and immortal, was always being tested. The Ethiopian texts depict the Watchers not as abstract entities, but as concrete, impactful beings whose decisions influence the moral and physical dimensions of humanity. Their story tells how the giants came to be, how corruption spread, and why the flood was needed in the end. The story shows how powerful and scary beings were, with powers that were far beyond human understanding and actions that left a lasting mark on the earth. In this way, the Ethiopian tradition fills in the blanks left by Western scripture, giving us a better picture of what happened before the flood and the amazing people who lived in this ancient world. The story of the Watchers is one of interest, caution, and moral contemplation, preserved solely in texts that resisted erasure by others. Living in the shadow of giants was not just a physical challenge. It was a constant test of how strong and moral people could be. Every day, regular people had problems that seemed impossible to solve. They were stuck between fear and faith, despair and determination. The giant's huge size reminded people that the world had changed, that power could overpower reason, and that following divine guidance was not a choice, but a necessity for survival. Parents were worried about their kids. Leaders had to make choices that could mean life or death for whole villages, and people had to keep hope alive in the middle of all the chaos. The Ethiopian texts show this human struggle very well. They show that the battles were fought not only with weapons, but also with hearts and minds, with courage and conviction tested at every turn. Fear was always there and easy to feel, and it changed how people acted in both small and big ways. At night, families huddled together, listening to the distant sounds of giants walking around the land, and wondering if their homes would be safe. People in the village stayed away from certain paths, changed their daily routines, and lived in almost constant fear as they tried to guess where beings with unmatched strength would go next. This fear had a huge psychological effect. It made it hard to think clearly, put a strain on relationships, and tested the very core of human resilience. Fear also taught people, making them aware of their limits and the need for divine guidance. It became a crucible in many ways, testing people's character and making them stronger or weaker when faced with fear or despair. Fear was accompanied by doubt and frustration, which weighed heavily on those who tried to act. How could humans, who are weak and mortal, fight giants who were born from the stars? How could communities fight against corruption when it seemed like power itself wanted them to give in? The Ethiopian Bible tells stories of people who had to deal with these issues and faced moral and ethical problems at every turn. Some leaders weren't sure if they should fight or run away, or if they should protect their people by standing up to their enemies or giving in. Farmers, hunters, and craftsmen had to make impossible choices, often having to choose between survival and doing the right thing. These struggles show the deep conflict between human free will and the strong influence of extraordinary beings. They also show the fragile balance between action, morality, and divine expectation. During these hard times, faith became both a safe place and a guiding force. The giants were so strong that people had to look outside of themselves for wisdom and protection from the gods. People who kept their faith even when they were scared found strength in prayer, rituals, and following God's orders. The Ethiopian texts tell stories of how prophetic warnings and visions helped people make important choices that kept their communities from being completely destroyed, and instead helped them survive. These moments show that human strength was linked to spiritual insight. Courage alone could not keep people safe without following God's rules. Faith was not passive. It was active and required discernment, patience, and moral courage to face a world ruled by beings that pushed both physical and moral limits. Important choices changed the course of whole communities. Leaders who listened to divine warnings often did extraordinary things to keep their people safe, like moving settlements, building defenses, or teaching moral codes to fight corruption. People who weren't giants also had to make choices that would affect the lives of their families and neighbors. They could stand up to immoral practices brought on by the giants or risk their lives in acts of resistance. These choices were very stressful and tested loyalty, bravery, and honesty. The Ethiopian texts keep these stories alive in great detail, showing how people acted in unusual situations and how every choice had effects that lasted for generations. The giants had a moral as well as a physical impact. Their presence made people more likely to be corrupt, give in to temptation, and disobey rules, which made it harder for people to do the right thing. Some communities gave in and made deals with the giants, or did things that went against what God wanted them to do. Others fought back, even though it put their lives in danger, because they thought it was more important to do the right thing than to stay alive in the short term. These stories show how hard it is to make moral decisions. They show that virtue is tested not only in calm times, but also in the most extreme situations. The Ethiopian Bible says that the giants made human choice more important, showing character and faith through the fire of extreme hardship. Fear, anger, despair, courage, hope, and awe were all present in these stories. Characters dealt with both internal and external conflicts at the same time, balancing the real threat of physical harm with the moral pressure of making a deal with the devil. Some people felt hopeless because they couldn't see how to beat the giant's power. Others found courage they didn't expect, either because they were told to by God or because they wanted to protect their loved ones. These emotional dynamics made the story deeper, turning it from a story about monsters and giants into a deep look at human strength, morality, and spirituality. The Ethiopian texts convey this emotional intricacy, guaranteeing that the giant's narrative is perceived not merely as history, but as an examination of the human condition. The moral lessons in these interactions are clear. Obedience to divine guidance, courage in the face of fear, and commitment to righteousness are essential for survival. The Ethiopian Bible stresses how moral action and physical survival are linked. Disobedience, moral compromise, or relying only on human strength often led to disaster. People weren't weak, but their power only mattered when it was in line with spiritual principles. These stories show that the giant's impact was as much a test of character as a test of survival, and that moral integrity could be a powerful force in a world where physical strength was the most important thing. The accounts of human giant confrontations illustrate that the world before the flood was a stage of significant moral and emotional turmoil. Giants change more than just the land. They also change communities, morals, and spiritual life. People's reactions, which are full of fear, doubt, and courage, show how hard it is to make decisions in extreme situations. The Ethiopian texts carefully preserve these lessons, making it clear that the giant's role went beyond physical destruction to include shaping human consciousness, moral reasoning, and spiritual insight. Modern readers can see what it was like to live in a time when courage, faith, and morality were put to the test in ways that few of us can really picture. This shows the timeless battle between great power and human virtue. The world before the flood was a place on the verge of chaos, where people and giants alike were weighed down by moral decay, fear, and incredible power. The skies grew dark, not just with storm clouds, but also with the shadow of God's judgment. The Ethiopian version of the flood story is very dramatic. It shows that the flood was not just a physical cleansing, but also a moral and spiritual reckoning for everyone who had gone against the natural and divine order. Every living thing felt the tremor of certain doom, but the giants, whose strange existence had turned human life upside down, were the most clearly affected. Their huge bodies, which used to be scary because they could control people, were now up against a force that was too strong or smart for them. The water rose to levels that were hard to imagine. It changed the shape of mountains, swallowed valleys and even whole cities, leaving no room for pride or defiance. The Ethiopian texts give a more detailed picture of what happened to the giants than the Western account, which often focuses on Noah's obedience and the survival of certain animals and people. These beings, born from the Watcher's forbidden unions, had corrupted the world with their strength, knowledge, and moral influence. Now they had to deal with the consequences of what they had done. The texts say that some giants tried to escape the rising waters by climbing mountains or hiding in caves. But the divine plan left no safe place for the lawless. Not only was the flood seen as punishment, but it was also seen as a carefully planned act of justice, a way to reset the earth and restore balance and protect the sanctity of life that had been threatened by unnatural corruption. People who had resisted the giant's influence and kept their faith were saved. This shows that mercy and judgment are linked, and that obedience and moral alignment are just as important as survival instinct. The story is more tense because it is told from the point of view of people who saw both the destruction and the strange way the giants kept fighting. Villagers and leaders told of the terrifying sight of huge shapes flailing against the rising waters, their strength useless against the overwhelming force of divine will. The Ethiopian Bible focuses on the emotional weight of these moments, the fear, despair, and relief that people who were spared felt as they watched the end of beings that had once ruled every part of their lives. Each wave that hit the land was more than just water. It was the embodiment of justice, moral correction, and the overwhelming power of a world ruled by laws that are higher than human or giant judgment. The story also looks closely at the moral and spiritual aspects of the flood. It wasn't just a story about destruction. It was also a lesson about being responsible and how God works. The giants stood for choices made against God's will, and their deaths were linked to the consequences of people going along with and fighting against God's will. People who had been led astray or corrupted by the giants had to face their own judgment. To survive, they had to admit their mistakes, repent, and follow God's instructions through Noah and other righteous leaders. The Ethiopian flood story tells a bigger story. It shows that justice includes both punishing wrongdoers and protecting those who do the right thing. Noah's role is central, but it is shown from a human point of view, highlighting the stress and doubt he felt while carrying out God's plan. Building the ark, gathering the animals, and watching the world fall apart around him were all very difficult for him emotionally and logistically. Seeing the giants' helplessness, the chaos of people running away, and the waters rising all the time required not only faith but also great courage and leadership. The Ethiopian texts use these images to make the audience think about how mentally difficult it would be to live through such an event, where survival depended on following orders, being able to tell right from wrong, and trusting a plan that was often hard to see and understand at the time. The Ethiopian story has information that Western stories don't, like how people and giants interacted even during the flood. Some giants, knowing that the flood was coming, tried to bargain, scare, or fight Noah and his followers. This showed how arrogant and desperate they were. The fact that they couldn't win adds to the moral weight of the story. No amount of physical power or inherited knowledge could change God's judgment. The flood was all-encompassing. It was an impartial force that destroyed both giants and the corrupt, while protecting the seeds of renewal through the righteous and obedient. The Ethiopian texts create a vivid drama of suspense, fear, and awe by showing these interactions. They put the audience in a world where survival and moral integrity were always linked. Water is not only seen as a destructive force, but also as a transformative one that cleanses moral decay while keeping the possibility of renewal alive. As the floodwaters receded, the remains of the giants and corrupted humans served as a haunting reminder of what could happen, while the preserved righteous, led by Noah, became the foundation for a new world. The Ethiopian Bible makes it clear that this act of cleansing was planned, necessary, and done with both justice and mercy in mind. People were given a chance to start over, free from the corruption that had spread because of the Watchers and their children. The story's tension comes from this balance: fear of destruction, awe at divine power, and hope for redemption all existed at the same time, keeping both the characters and the audience emotionally invested in every moment. The Ethiopian tradition's story of the flood also looks at the philosophical and moral consequences of such a disaster. It asks how people understand God's will, how power and morality are related, and how survival is related to doing the right thing. There is a moral ecosystem that includes giants, humans, and divine actors. In this ecosystem, every action has consequences and every choice matters. By dramatizing the giant's struggle, the human's obedience, and Noah's leadership, the texts show what happens when things are out of balance. They show a world where power is useless without moral and spiritual alignment. The flood is not just a historical event. It is also a complex moral picture that shows how choices made before, during, and after a disaster can have far-reaching effects on justice and mercy. The Ethiopian account makes the flood feel real by using vivid descriptions of the rising waters, the scared giants, and the desperate people trying to stay alive. Every detail, the sound of water flooding valleys, the cries of people running away, and the giants' useless attempts to get away, makes the tension and emotion even stronger. The story makes sure that readers or viewers aren't just watching. They're also involved in the stakes and understand how big the event is, both physically and morally. The flood serves as a lens for the audience to comprehend the ramifications of transgression, the significance of faith, and the precarious equilibrium between justice and mercy, thereby rendering the narrative relevant beyond its historical setting. As the floodwaters went down and the world started to recover from the damage, a new fragile reality began to take shape. People had to rebuild after the flood, and they were spread out over lands that had once been underwater. In whispers and shadows, pieces of the world before the flood remained. The Ethiopian Bible says that some of these remnants were giants who had somehow survived the flood in hidden valleys, far-off mountains, or other isolated areas. In Ethiopian culture, these survivors are not just myths or stories told around fires. They are real forces that continue to shape human experience and history. Their continued presence made people feel both awe and fear as they tried to understand how to live with creatures that were much bigger and stronger than they were. The giants that lived on carried with them memories and traits from a world that had been fundamentally changed. They were also a living reminder of events that had changed the earth. It was hard for them to get along with people who lived after the flood. In some cases, they were alone, living quietly in the wilderness, where their influence was felt but not directly. In other cases, their presence changed human culture, leading to stories of giant beings and amazing heroes who fought them. These giants became both warning figures and mysterious witnesses to the moral and spiritual lessons of the flood. Their continued existence tested human morality, courage, and faith in ways both subtle and obvious, reminding survivors that divine justice had not removed all challenges, but had only changed their order. The Ethiopian texts imply that the remaining giants impacted the evolution of post-flood civilizations. When early human communities were rebuilding after the fall of their civilization, they sometimes ran into these powerful beings. This led to stories of fighting, negotiating, and living together in peace. Some giants may have gone into hiding because they knew that the divine plan was to spare humanity while punishing corruption. Others, on the other hand, left their mark on the land by shaping settlements, making obstacles, or even inspiring human innovation as communities found ways to survive and adapt. These interactions, preserved in Ethiopian tradition, suggest a deep connection between natural history and morality, where extraordinary beings continued to test human virtue long after the flood. It was important to learn moral and spiritual lessons from the giants that were still alive. People were reminded that they had to always be brave, honest, and follow the rules. The giants' mere presence made people think about power, temptation, and duty. What should you do when you meet someone who is very powerful? How do communities make sure that things are right when the memory of past corruption still lingers in the land and the creatures that live there? The Ethiopian Bible poses these inquiries through narrative intricacy, underscoring that morality is dynamic and mere survival is inadequate without conformity to divine principles. Giants, as living reminders of a past that was wronged, served as both reminders and teachers, helping people understand justice, self-control, and spiritual watchfulness. These giants had a big impact on culture as well. Their presence became the basis for myths, legends, and oral traditions that have been passed down through the years. Folklore often has stories about huge warriors, strange travelers, and strong strangers, which could be memories of how the giants from after the flood interacted with people. Early craftsmen, storytellers, and religious leaders may have used symbolic language to record these events, passing down lessons about bravery, obedience, and the dangers of pride. In certain areas, monumental architecture or inexplicable artifacts were ascribed to these entities, bolstering the belief that enduring giants exerted a significant and lasting influence on human civilization. The Ethiopian texts, by highlighting these connections, encourage contemporary readers to re-evaluate the origins of myths and the influence of extraordinary beings on collective memory. Living next to living giants had a strong effect on people's minds as well. Normal people had to deal with fear and respect, balancing their desire to stay safe with their moral choices. Some communities tried to live together peacefully by setting up rules and agreements that let life go on without any problems. Some people were threatened or attacked, which pushed the limits of human creativity and courage. The giants' continued existence made people think about the nature of power. Is it just physical, or is true strength defined by moral authority and restraint? The Ethiopian texts make the post-flood era more human by showing that people were active agents who made decisions in very unusual situations. This shows that survival depended not only on skill and bravery, but also on moral judgment. Geographically, surviving giants are said to live in places that are very far away or very isolated, like mountain ranges, dense forests, and plains that are very far away. These areas became places of mystery, where people couldn't explore very much, and stories grew in both fear and interest. Travelers, shepherds, or hunters sometimes talked about their encounters, which were kept in oral histories and later written down in religious texts. These stories strengthen the idea that giants are beings who exist between the divine past and the mortal present, making them neither completely accessible nor completely removed from human experience. These kinds of stories led to a way of thinking in which the world after the flood was a place of moral testing, where remnants of great power pushed people to act with wisdom, courage, and faith. The Ethiopian Bible's focus on surviving giants shows how divine and moral law can have long-lasting effects. The flood changed the earth, but it didn't get rid of all the signs of corruption or all the tests of virtue. People and giants who survived were living reminders of how creation, sin, and redemption are all connected. People had to act responsibly, follow God's guidance, and deal with beings that taught them both how to use their power and how to hold back. The giants that lived after the flood were therefore catalysts for reflection, changing the moral, cultural, and spiritual landscape of civilizations long after the waters had receded. Their presence compelled humanity to transcend fear, to exercise discernment, and to uphold moral integrity, thereby guaranteeing that the lessons of history were neither overlooked nor disregarded. The Ethiopian texts connect the past, present, and imagination through these stories, mixing history with moral and spiritual lessons. The giants are not just remnants of a world that has been destroyed. They're also active participants in the journey of humanity, affecting behavior, shaping culture, and testing faith. The surviving giants left behind a legacy that is woven into the fabric of human civilization. This legacy includes stories of huge warriors, unexplained artifacts, moral dilemmas, and lessons in courage and obedience. Their story makes us think about power, morality, and the long-lasting effects of our decisions. It shows how extraordinary people can have a lasting impact on ordinary lives, even after the disaster that created them is over. For hundreds of years, people have whispered about giants. These stories can be found in myths, artifacts, and strange ruins that are scattered throughout human history. Mainstream scholars often say that these stories are just legends or exaggerations, but the Ethiopian Bible gives us a way to think about them as real beings that had a real impact on early civilizations. The text characterizes giants not as ephemeral myths, but as persistent entities, influencing humanity's moral, spiritual, and physical realms long prior to the advent of contemporary documentation. When compared to archaeological finds and old stories, these accounts suggest that people may have lived with amazing beings whose legacy quietly shaped the foundations of civilizations. Could these giants, which are often thought of as myths, really be the missing piece that explains how human culture and great achievements came to be? The question is both interesting and scary. Historians and archaeologists have long recorded anomalies that resist standard interpretation: enormous stone edifices, complex ruins, and tales of gigantic warriors or constructors. The massive walls of Baalbek, the giant statues of Easter Island, and even signs of megalithic buildings in Africa all suggest that people were influenced by beings that were very big or very smart. Conventional narratives attribute human ingenuity exclusively. However, the Ethiopian Bible posits an alternative perspective. Survivors of pre-flood giants may have transmitted techniques, evoked awe, and left nuanced remnants that connected pre- and post-flood knowledge. These texts correspond with irregularities in historical timelines, lending credence to narratives formerly regarded as mythological. The giant's existence is not merely a curiosity, but a possible elucidation for enigmas that persist in confounding researchers. Today, legends from different cultures also support the idea that extraordinary beings had a big impact on early human history. There are many stories in Africa, Asia, and the Americas about huge beings living with people, teaching them skills or scaring them. The stories in the Ethiopian Bible are similar to these, and they stress the moral and spiritual effects of the giants' interactions with people. The Ethiopian tradition provides a distinctive perspective by enshrining these narratives in a sacred text, portraying giants not merely as folklore, but as historical figures with significant ramifications. People sometimes wrote down these events as divine encounters or legendary feats, often talking about battles, alliances, or moral lessons that giants taught. The result is a tapestry that mixes history, legend, and morality, which makes us question what we think we know about the limits of human experience. Archaeological discoveries also suggest remarkable human or semi-human entities. There have been reports of skeletal remains of unusually large stature, oversized tools, and artifacts that can't be explained. However, mainstream science often doesn't believe these findings. In the Ethiopian context, these irregularities achieve coherence. The Bible has a lot of information about giants, including their size, strength, and influence. This makes it possible that these remains are the physical proof of beings that are mentioned in holy texts. For example, stories about huge tombs, weapons, or fortifications could show that giants were real, or that they had an effect on early civilizations that were trying to protect themselves, copy them, or stay alive in a world where they once lived. These connections turn individual discoveries into a bigger story, showing history as a long series of interactions between people and extraordinary forces. There are hints that giants had an effect on civilizations after the flood, civilizations that developed near areas where giants were said to have lived show strange things in their architecture, social structure, and myths. Early cities may have used monumental building techniques that they learnt from watching giants work, or stories of giants may have helped people stick together and follow moral rules by showing how power can be abused. Religious rituals, myths, and moral teachings may all exhibit remnants of interactions with these powerful entities. The Ethiopian Bible, by preserving detailed accounts of giants, serves as a conduit linking historical echoes with spiritual and moral teachings. indicating that human development was influenced not only by divine providence or natural evolution, but also by extraordinary beings whose actions had enduring repercussions. The stories make people curious by putting moral and ethical questions next to historical observations. Did humans ever really live alone, or did they share the earth with beings who were stronger and smarter than they were? Could stories from long ago about heroic battles, godlike teachers, or huge buildings come from people meeting giants? The Ethiopian Bible prompts contemplation of these possibilities, presenting a narrative where myth and history intersect. By looking at the text, along with archaeological clues and legendary stories, viewers are asked to think about the lines between reality and legend again. The moral aspect is just as important. The giant's presence, both before and after the flood, serves as a warning about corruption, obedience, and the effects of ignoring divine order. Additionally, myths from different cultures often match up in surprising ways. In Mesopotamian epics, African oral traditions, and ancient American legends, there are stories about giant beings, amazing warriors, and hybrids of gods and humans. The Ethiopian Bible places these stories in a logical order, making it clear that these beings were not just symbols, but real people that people met. This view goes against the usual story of history and suggests that there is a lost layer of human experience preserved in texts that Western traditions often ignore. The Ethiopian tradition links giants to moral lessons, societal progress, and historical oddities, offering an interpretive framework that elevates curiosity to profound investigation. The giants may have existed, their influence intricately integrated into the essence of human civilization. The tension in these stories comes from the fact that we don't know what will happen next or what will happen next. People are asked to picture huge shapes moving across landscapes, changing early societies, and leaving permanent marks on both the physical and moral worlds. These stories make you think about morality, survival, and how people can be smart when they are up against a lot of power. The Ethiopian Bible's focus on spiritual and moral consequences makes these stories more than just exciting. They are also lessons that show how extraordinary history can be an exploration of human choice, divine justice, and moral responsibility. Each archaeological clue or old story is put in context, which makes us think that what we thought was a myth might actually be a distorted memory of real events that were kept alive. Through sacred texts and collective memory, the Ethiopian Bible says that there are lost layers of human history that are waiting to be found by linking giants to real historical and archaeological evidence. These layers make us question what we think we know about civilization, technology, and morality. They make us think that extraordinary beings may have shaped the world in ways we don't fully understand yet. Every ruin, legend, and skeletal anomaly can be a link in this chain of lost history, and the giant's presence gives us both answers and more questions. Were these beings real, or are we reading too much into bits of history? The Ethiopian Bible asserts that these inquiries are not only plausible, but crucial for comprehending the entirety of human experience before and after the flood, engendering a profound sense of awe, curiosity, and lingering wonder that persists through time. The story of giants before and after the flood makes us think about our own lives, morals, and responsibilities. It's not just about how big or strong they were. These old stories, which are still in the Ethiopian Bible, show that people have always had to deal with things that are hard to understand. Just like early humans had to deal with real giants, we have to deal with metaphorical giants today. Big problems, moral questions, and tests of faith that require bravery, judgment, and faith. The stories make us think. If people used to live in a world with beings of great power, what can we learn from that about how to deal with the pressures of our time? The giant's impact on people, both physically and spiritually, shows how responsible people are. When faced with overwhelming power, people had to act, make decisions, and take a stand. Following divine guidance, making careful decisions, and having moral integrity were not optional. They were necessary for survival, spiritual growth, and keeping the community together. Our problems today may not be huge monsters in the woods or huge people from stories, but the moral and ethical issues are still the same. In a world full of problems like injustice, lies, and corruption, we are called to be responsible. The story of giants reminds us that courage is often moral as well as physical, and that the strength to keep going comes from sticking to your values and principles instead of giving in to fear or temptation. Faith is a major theme in these old stories, showing how important it has been for thousands of years. The giants were a test of human faith in both a literal and figurative sense, putting up obstacles that required faith in God's plan. Early humans had to deal with fear, doubt, and moral confusion while still believing in the bigger plan that controlled their lives. For modern viewers, this makes them think about how faith can help them make decisions, shape their character, and stay strong when things get tough. The stories of the giants show that faith is not something you just sit back and let happen. It is an active, guiding force that helps people deal with personal problems, social issues, or moral questions in a world that often seems too big or unclear. These old stories also help us understand what it means to be ethical. The giants made the effects of human choices even bigger, showing that actions, or not taking action, can have big effects. Communities that tried to live in harmony with God's law lived and thrived, while those that didn't follow moral rules fell apart. Just like the flood wiped out evil from the earth, in today's world, this story makes us think about responsibility, fairness, and how our choices affect others. Even in daily life, where problems are less clear-cut than they were in the past, the idea still holds. Moral choices affect the direction of people, groups, and civilizations. The Ethiopian Bible shows how the giants' influence affects people, making morality a real thing with real effects. The dramatic and emotional stories of giants also let us look at how strong and creative people can be. When faced with being stronger than themselves, humans had to change, plan, and keep going. The giants are like models of huge problems, while the people in the story are examples of bravery, creativity, and moral clarity. People can relate this to problems at work, in their relationships, and in society today. They know that resilience is built when things get tough. The story of the giants teaches us to see challenges as tests instead of failures. This encourages us to actively engage with the world instead of giving up. When you think about the ancient giants in today's world, it's natural to ask yourself questions that make you think. If extraordinary beings influence the initial trajectory of humanity, how ought we to conduct ourselves, cognizant that our decisions reverberate through time? What can we learn from the moral and spiritual battles that people have to fight against huge forces? And how can these lessons help us make decisions every day? The Ethiopian Bible depicts the giants as both historical entities and catalysts for introspection, encouraging individuals to reflect on their personal values, societal conventions, and spiritual priorities. In this light, the story is not just an interesting piece of history. It is also a call to think carefully about how we live, how we treat others, and how we honor values that last longer than our own lives. The story also talks about how fear and courage work together, which is a lesson that is very relevant to modern life. People who lived among giants had to deal with fear while staying strong, balancing their need to survive with their sense of right and wrong. Fear can take many forms today, such as uncertainty, injustice, loss, or moral compromise. However, the principle is still the same. Courage is not the absence of fear, but the willingness to do the right thing even when you are afraid. The Ethiopian Bible emphasizes the emotional and spiritual aspects of human-giant interactions, prompting viewers to acknowledge that moral and ethical courage is an essential requisite in confronting physical, social, or spiritual adversities. The story of giants also makes us think about human history in a bigger way and where we fit into it. The survival, impact, and ethical ramifications of these entities serve as a reminder that the world is influenced by forces, both perceptible and imperceptible, that transcend our immediate understanding. The Ethiopian Bible keeps these stories alive to show how people act, how God punishes wrongdoers, and what happens when people are corrupt or disobedient. The story connects the past and the present, which makes people think about how moral responsibility is always there, how important it is to be careful with moral issues, and how history can help us make better choices in the future. The giants are not relics that have been frozen in time. They are catalysts for insight that help us understand how we should deal with power, responsibility, and faith. In the end, the old stories make people think deeply about their own spiritual and moral lives. The Ethiopian Bible turns curiosity into contemplation by showing how important human choices are in a world shared with amazing beings. People who watch are encouraged to think about how they would react to problems, how their moral choices affect others, and how faith can guide them. The giants, with their huge presence and historical impact, are like mirrors that show us our potential, our duties, and the moral landscapes we navigate every day. The question is not just what giants were around in the past, but also what giants we have to deal with in ourselves and in society today. What do we do when we can't control things? And how do we keep our values of faith, justice, and responsibility in a world that constantly tests them? These thoughts changed the story from a long time ago into a close, emotionally powerful guide for living, encouraging people to think about not only the past, but also their part in shaping the moral and spiritual future. There have always been truths that have been hidden, missed, or intentionally suppressed. The story of giants before the flood is one of these truths. Western traditions, influenced by selective translations, theological objectives, and cultural prejudices, frequently downplayed or completely disregarded. The narratives preserved in texts such as the Ethiopian Bible. The Ethiopian Bible preserves, in vivid detail, what the Western canon presents as fragmented or symbolic, giving voice to narratives that challenge conventional understanding of human history. This has led to a hidden layer of biblical knowledge that makes us wonder what has been lost, why it was hidden, and how these stories can help us understand our past. The mere existence of such accounts in Ethiopia, largely untainted by Western influence, implies that a deliberate curation of history may have transpired, rendering much of humanity oblivious to the giants' existence and their significant influence on early civilizations. It's not a new thing to hide information. In the past, scholars, religious leaders, and political leaders often decided which texts were copied, canonized, or shared. Some books were left out of the Western Bible because they were hard to understand, could be misinterpreted, or could challenge the authority of established religions. For instance, the Book of Enoch has long, detailed stories about the Watchers and their giant children. These stories show truths that make simple stories about how humans and gods interact less believable. Even though lost or hidden books turned into myths, oral traditions and local manuscripts kept bits and pieces of these forbidden histories alive. Ethiopia, with its long-standing Orthodox Church and careful preservation of the complete 81-88 book canon, became a rare repository of this lost knowledge, safeguarding stories that Western Christianity largely neglected or deliberately excluded. This historical suppression created a void in which the true nature of giants, the Watchers, and pre-flood corruption remained concealed from the wider world. For centuries, Western scholars either disregarded mentions of Nephilim and giants or regarded them as allegorical hyperboles. The Ethiopian Bible, on the other hand, shows that these events were real, important, and morally significant. This shows that early humans faced both physical and spiritual challenges that were beyond what most people could understand. The Ethiopian Bible preserves the Book of Enoch and other canonical texts that are absent in Western traditions, thereby providing a more comprehensive historical account and contesting the idea that the Western Bible conveys the entire narrative. The omissions in Western texts underscore the potential intentional obfuscation of significant aspects of early human history, ethics, and divine interaction. There are many reasons why this kind of suppression happens. Political, theological, and cultural dynamics frequently converged, resulting in the selective preservation of texts. Accounts that challenged doctrinal uniformity, questioned hierarchical authority, or contradicted established moral frameworks were susceptible to censorship. Giants, with their great physical strength and disruptive power, and the Watchers, whose rebellion against the divine human order was too complicated, too provocative, and too destabilizing for institutions that wanted to control religious knowledge to fully accept. The Ethiopian tradition, on the other hand, was isolated from much of the West's political and geographical influence. It kept these texts safe, telling stories that show the full range of divine justice, human struggle, and the extraordinary presence of beings that shaped history. The effects of this suppression are very deep. For generations, people in the Western world have not been able to read these stories, which has left holes in their understanding of history, morality, and spiritual responsibility. People mostly forgot about the giants' influence on societies before the flood, the moral decay they caused, and the role of the Watchers. The story of early humans seems incomplete, cleaned up, and less morally complex without these accounts. The Ethiopian Bible brings these things back, showing that people were not just passive observers or people who didn't have an impact on their own history. They were active agents, dealing with forces of great power and moral importance. And they had to be brave, smart, and make moral choices in a world that required all of these things. The tension and mystery are strong for people who are finding these hidden histories. The Ethiopian Bible is like a key that opens doors to knowledge that was purposefully kept from people or ignored. Every description of how big the giants were, every story about how the Watchers broke the rules, and every moral lesson in the text makes us question what we think we know about biblical history. By reading these texts, viewers are drawn into a story that goes beyond familiar ones, where the lines between myth and history are blurred and moral. Spiritual and cultural truths come to light from old manuscripts. This revelation makes people curious, doubtful, and amazed, which makes for an immersive experience that makes them want to learn more and think about it. The exciting part of hidden knowledge is the tension between what is known and what is not. Ancient human societies contended with the existence of giants, but subsequent generations remained oblivious to the complete extent of these occurrences due to intentional omissions and selective transmission of texts. Today, finding these lost histories is like putting together a broken puzzle that changes how we think about where people came from, how they grew spiritually, and the moral code that guided early civilizations. By keeping these stories alive, the Ethiopian Bible gives us a glimpse into a more complicated and morally difficult past. It shows how power, corruption, and divine justice work together in ways that the Western canon mostly hides. Furthermore, the narratives of giants and watchers retained in Ethiopia reflect overarching trends of human inquisitiveness and insurrection against authority. Just as early humans had to deal with powerful beings, readers have to deal with the conflict between what is known and what is not. The Ethiopian Bible shows that history is rarely neutral. What is written down, left out, or hidden has a big effect on how people understand culture, spirituality, and morality. By looking at these texts, people can see how brave and wise the people who kept forbidden knowledge were. They can also see that finding these stories again is not just an academic exercise, but also a moral and spiritual awakening that makes us question what we think we know and try to learn more about our shared past. People who want to learn more about what has been hidden are still fascinated by the mystery surrounding these texts. Each passage about the giants, their evil deeds, and the divine interventions is exciting because it reveals information that was thought to be lost. The Ethiopian Bible places these revelations in a consistent historical and spiritual context, explaining moral and cultural events, connecting myths to historical oddities, and giving moral advice based on true stories. This isn't just a story about giants or lost books for viewers. It's a chance to think about history again, face up to hidden knowledge, and think about what happens when people ignore or forget important truths. The story is dramatic, emotionally engaging, and intellectually challenging because of the tension in the plot, the moral weight of the characters, and the hidden histories that come together. It takes people into a long-forgotten past that may still have an effect on the present. Picture a world covered in fog, with huge figures casting huge shadows over valleys, mountains, and forests. When the giants of old walked, their presence was so strong that the air seemed to shake with their steps, and the ground groaned under their weight. Their shapes against the rising sun were both beautiful and scary. Their limbs were like old trees. Their eyes glowed with a strange awareness, and their voices rumbled like thunder from far away. Humans, who were small and weak compared to these amazing creatures, walked through landscapes where these creatures were in charge. Each time they met one, their bravery was put to the test. The Ethiopian Bible keeps these visions not just as historical records, but as living, breathing images that invite readers and viewers to fully immerse themselves in the drama of a world shared with giants. Forests were not just places to hide. They were also places where people could be in danger and test their morals. Picture people hiding under huge trees, with the leaves shaking every time a giant walks by. Every crack of a branch and every distant roar made the human heart race with fear. Villages on hills or by rivers were at risk because they knew that these huge creatures could come down at any time, changing the balance between life and death. The Ethiopian texts go into great detail about these meetings. The giants' hands could uproot trees, their voices could scare even the bravest warriors, and their moral corruption spread like a shadow over the lands they traveled. People had to deal with both the physical and spiritual dangers, and every choice they made had consequences. This created a scene of suspense and human strength. Then there were the Watchers, angels who came down from the sky. Their arrival made people feel both awe and fear. Their shapes were beautiful and scary at the same time, glowing with divine light that made them look both beautiful and dangerous. These heavenly beings, who broke divine order to interact with humans, became the ancestors of the giants, making the moral and physical chaos of the time even worse. The Ethiopian Bible shows people trying to keep their faith and moral clarity while they watched or ran away from things that made no sense. They were stuck between the power of God and the danger of the world. One can picture the interplay of light and shadow, the tension between divine brilliance and earthly darkness, and the palpable sense of suspense as humanity navigated a world transformed by supernatural forces, by imagining these moments through a cinematic lens. Of course, the flood was a key event in this visual story. Clouds rolled in and darkened the sky, lightning flashed across the wide horizon, and rain fell in unending torrents, turning rivers into raging torrents and plains into vast oceans. The giants, who were scary in life, faced the overwhelming power of divine intervention. Their steps were swallowed by rising waters, and their roars were drowned out by the unstoppable force of nature. People watched from the edges, and their faith was both tested and strengthened as they saw the world become cleaner morally and physically. The Ethiopian Bible paints these scenes with a focus on suspense and emotion. People are shaking, praying, and finding courage in the middle of disaster. The flood is so big that only the tallest giants can see it. Each wave and lightning strike brings the tension between fear and hope to a new level. The size and spectacle were not the only things that caught people's attention. It was also how people reacted to these scenes. People showed incredible bravery, clear moral judgment, and acts of kindness and faith that stood out in the midst of the chaos. Picture a lone person on a hill, watching giants fall and waters rise, but still praying with their hands raised, their faith keeping the storm at bay. Or a group of villagers leading the scared and weak through a forest, avoiding both giant and natural threats with the help of their own cleverness, bravery, and divine guidance. These moments, which are part of Ethiopian culture, tell dramatic emotional stories that make people feel personally involved and imagine what it would be like to live in a world where faith and courage could mean the difference. Between life and death, there were lots of suspenseful moments all over the world before the flood. The giants, who were unpredictable and morally corrupt, could show up in open fields or dark valleys, forcing people to act quickly. The Watchers also added to the tension by being mysterious about their goals and doing things that made it hard to tell the difference between good and bad. People were always in a dance of waiting, being scared and making choices. When you think about these meetings, you can picture tense standoffs under the red glow of a setting sun, the rustle of leaves hiding the sound of giant footsteps, and the distant rumble of divine presence, reminding mortals that unseen forces were always at work. Every scene and every movement is full of emotion, which adds to the dramatic stakes that the Ethiopian Bible keeps so well. Even normal landscapes became very important when they were in the shadow of giants and the Watchers. Mountains turned into safe havens or places of despair, and rivers were both lifelines and places where scary things happened. Each scene was a canvas of human struggle, faith, and creativity, set against the overwhelming presence of the extraordinary. The Ethiopian Bible shows these differences: light and dark, small and big, human willpower and moral and supernatural problems. People should not only think about how big each moment is, but also how deep it is emotionally. The stories are full of tension, fear, hope, and the triumph of the human spirit. By turning these texts into visual stories, people are encouraged to fully engage with them. One can imagine whole scenes: giants walking across plains, their shadows stretching across fields, people rushing to get food, protect their families, and keep their moral compass. Watchers coming down from the sky in bright light, the air shimmering with otherworldly energy. And finally, the flood changing the earth, a dramatic climax of nature's power and divine justice. These vivid cinematic images bring the old stories to life, making people see, feel, and picture themselves in a world that is both historical and spiritual, as well as emotionally powerful. In the end, the scenes in the Ethiopian Bible serve as both a warning and an inspiration. They show how big the forces people used to face were, and how brave, faithful, and morally responsible people had to be to deal with them. The giants, the flood, the Watchers, and the corrupted people all come together to make a picture that sparks the imagination, builds suspense, and shows how important human choice is. Through this lens, viewers can see the drama of life before the flood, relate to the struggles of people, and appreciate the depth and richness of stories that are often lost to history but are preserved in great detail in the Ethiopian canon. Each mental picture and emotionally charged scene turns these old stories from abstract history into a vivid, immersive journey that makes the past feel real and important to people today. As we read the long story of giants, Watchers, the flood, and the hidden histories in the Ethiopian Bible, we start to see patterns that are also present in our own lives. The stories aren't just about huge beings or divine interventions. They're also about morality, responsibility, and the choices people have to make when they are faced with things they can't understand. Imagine standing on the edge of an old valley, watching giants walk by and knowing that every choice you make could have big effects, not just on your own survival, but also on the moral and spiritual health of your community. The Ethiopian Bible stresses that people were never passive. They were responsible for their actions, faced with the temptations and corrupting influences of those around them, and faced with the weight of divine justice that would shape the course of history. Faith becomes a central idea, a guiding force in the midst of chaos and doubt. People had to depend on something bigger than themselves when they were in the shadow of giants. They had to believe that their moral choices and obedience mattered, even when the world seemed hopelessly dark. Every brave act and every choice to stand up for justice or kindness was a thread in the tapestry of human strength. The Watcher's interference, the giant's fear, and the flood's destruction were all tests of survival, but they were also tests of honesty, morality, and following God's will. When people watch these stories, they are reminded that faith is not something that happens on its own. It is an active engagement with the world and a promise to tell the difference between right and wrong, even when things seem too hard. Another lesson that runs through these old stories is the importance of personal and group responsibility. People had to deal with very difficult problems, but each person's decisions helped shape the world's moral arc. The giants made people think about how brave they were, what was important to them, and how willing they were to work for the good of all. Every act of kindness, protection, or moral defiance against corruption had effects that went beyond just keeping people alive. The Ethiopian Bible serves as a reminder that history is influenced by decisions made in times of stress, and that the moral and spiritual ramifications of those decisions extend far beyond the present moment. For contemporary audiences, this signifies a contemplation of the ethical choices we encounter daily, our response to injustice, and the obligation we hold for the welfare of others. Another thing that ties these stories together over time is the divine plan. The flood was a terrible event, but it wasn't just punishment. It was part of a bigger plan to keep the possibility of a fair and moral humanity alive. The destruction of the giants, the guidance given to Noah and his family, and the preservation of sacred knowledge all show that divine intervention is both just and merciful. The Ethiopian Bible makes these differences clearer than many Western accounts do. This shows that God's plan is complex and takes into account the complexity of human experience and the need for moral growth. This gives viewers a chance to think about things, realizing that even scary or overwhelming events may have a higher purpose, and that hard times are chances to show courage, judgment, and faith. As we think about these old stories, questions that make us think naturally come to mind. What would Enoch think of the modern world if he saw the corruption, the giants' fear, and the flood's final cleanup? How would his views on human morality, divine justice, and spiritual responsibility shape our understanding of history today? The Ethiopian Bible encourages readers to do more than just read. It asks them to get involved, picture the stories, and make the lessons their own. It pushes us to look beyond what we already know and question what we think we know. Could it be that a lot of history, morality, and spiritual insight has been filtered or kept secret, waiting for people who are willing to read hidden texts, face hard truths, and think about what people do? When we bring these thoughts into the present, the call to action becomes clear. Knowledge that isn't acted on can become abstract, but viewers can turn understanding into real action. You can keep the conversation going by subscribing to the channel, leaving a comment with your name and city, and sharing the story with your friends. This turns individual curiosity into a group search for hidden truths. Super Thanks is a way to help the research and storytelling that brings these lost histories to light, so that more people can read the dramatic, morally charged stories in the Ethiopian Bible. By taking part in these actions, viewers are not only interacting with the story, but they are also helping to recover knowledge, challenge conventional narratives, and reconnect with truths that history may have hidden. The link to the Complete Ethiopian Bible, 88 books and the Book of Enoch in English, makes sure that anyone who wants to learn more can easily get to the original texts. The texts are more than just historical records. They take you on an immersive journey into a world where morality, courage, divine intervention, and human responsibility all come together. Every page makes you think, imagine, and feel something, which shows that these stories are still important today. Through reading and contemplation, individuals acquire understanding of the ramifications of decisions, the interaction between divine and human agency, and the persistent conflict between moral clarity and corruption. As we end this chapter of reflection, we can't forget how big, emotional, and dramatic these old events were. There were once giants on earth, the Watchers changed people's fates, and the flood changed life itself. But beyond the show is a deep moral and spiritual framework that speaks directly to all people. The choices we make, the courage we show, the faith we have, and the responsibility we take on are all important in ways that go beyond the present moment. These lessons stay with us, making us think deeply about our own moral and spiritual journey and the questions that history leaves us. If Enoch saw this, will you see history in a different light? Will you see the moral and spiritual risks in your own life? And will you share these insights to help others wake up, reconnect with truths that have been hidden for a long time, and promise to live with courage, wisdom, and faith? Were giants really walking the earth before the flood? This is not just a question of imagination or old legends. It is a mystery that has puzzled scholars, theologians, and history enthusiasts for centuries. Long before the waters of the flood covered the earth, there existed beings of extraordinary size and power, creatures whose presence changed the course of humanity in ways most of us have never been taught. These were the Nephilim, mentioned briefly in the book of Genesis, described as the offspring of the sons of God and the daughters of men. But the story does not end there. The Ethiopian Bible, one of the oldest and most complete versions of Scripture, preserves details that the Western Bible does not, hidden histories that reveal a world far stranger, far more complex, and far more terrifying than we ever imagined. Picture a world where humans walked side by side with towering giants, some reaching heights that would make modern skyscrapers seem small in comparison. These were not mere myths. They were beings that inspired awe, fear, and even worship. Ancient texts suggest that the giants' sheer presence brought chaos and corruption, spreading both physical and moral devastation across civilizations. The earth was a place of conflict, where human societies struggled to survive amid beings whose strength and influence were beyond comprehension. And while much of this history was obscured over time, traces of it have survived in fragments, whispers preserved in texts that have been hidden or ignored for centuries. The Nephilim, as briefly mentioned in the Genesis account, are enigmatic. Who were the sons of God that came to earth, and why did they take human wives? What was the purpose of their extraordinary offspring? The Western Bible provides only a brief glimpse, leaving many questions unanswered. It speaks of giants, of human wickedness, and of divine judgment through the flood, but it does not explain the full extent of the giants' existence, their influence on human culture, or the moral corruption they introduced. This is where the Ethiopian Bible becomes critical. It preserves details lost in Western translations, offering a window into a world of lost knowledge and forbidden history. In imagining this pre-flood world, it is not hard to feel a sense of awe. How would humans have lived alongside beings of immense size and strength? How did they build civilizations, maintain societies, or even attempt to survive when giants roamed the earth with capabilities beyond human imagination? These questions are not idle speculation. They strike at the heart of our understanding of ancient history and the origins of human culture. The Ethiopian Bible paints a picture of a planet teeming with life in forms that challenge everything we think we know. It tells of beings who could not only alter the physical landscape, but also sway the spiritual and moral direction of humanity. The corruption they spread was profound, reaching into every corner of the human experience. Modern curiosity about giants and hidden histories is more than a fascination with the fantastical. Archaeological discoveries, ancient legends, and obscure manuscripts hint at truths that mainstream history has overlooked or dismissed. The stories preserved in the Ethiopian Bible serve as a bridge between the mythic and the historical, between what is remembered and what has been suppressed. They invite us to question not only the events of the distant past, but also the completeness of the records we rely upon today. Were the giants merely a metaphor, or were they a reality whose traces still echo through human history? These questions have captivated the minds of scholars and seekers alike, driving an ongoing quest to uncover what has been hidden for thousands of years. Imagine standing on the edge of a cliff in that ancient world, gazing across the vast landscapes where giants walked and humans struggled. The air would have been thick with tension and fear, a constant reminder that humanity was no longer the uncontested force on Earth. Civilizations were fragile, moral codes under siege, and every human choice carried consequences magnified by the presence of these towering beings. Yet even amidst fear, humans persisted, building, learning, and attempting to navigate a world that was anything but ordinary. It is this tension, the struggle of humanity against forces far greater than themselves, that gives the pre-flood story its enduring power. The Ethiopian Bible preserves these narratives, allowing us to glimpse the complex interplay of humans, giants, and divine oversight in a way no other text does. As we delve into these ancient accounts, it becomes clear that what has been left out of Western traditions is not merely detail, but entire dimensions of history. The Ethiopian Bible describes giants not just as physical marvels, but as agents of profound influence, spiritual, moral, and cultural. It hints at lessons about human responsibility, divine judgment, and the consequences of unchecked power. It challenges us to rethink what we know about the past and to consider how much has been obscured by time, translation, and selective preservation. The story of the giants is not just a story of size and strength. It is a story of humanity's struggle to maintain its integrity in a world where extraordinary forces were at play. The mysteries preserved in these texts call upon us to engage with history in a deeper, more inquisitive way. They remind us that the world of the past was neither simple nor easily understood. Every fragment, every verse, every mention of giants or the Nephilim is a clue to a broader narrative that has been largely forgotten. And as we uncover these stories, we are invited to reflect not only on ancient events, but on their implications for how we understand morality, human behavior, and divine intervention. The Ethiopian Bible challenges our assumptions, urging us to look beyond the familiar and consider the astonishing truths that have been hidden in plain sight for millennia. Bible says, subscribe to the channel and share with your friends to help us reach 10,000 subscribers. Support us financially via Super Thanks. Comment your name and city and tell us what time you are watching from. If you want the complete Ethiopian Bible, 88 books, and Book of Enoch English, the link is in the description. Long before the biblical stories that most people in the West know about were written down, there was a tradition that kept more than what modern readers usually see. The Ethiopian Bible is one of the most complete and oldest versions of the Bible. It has between 81 and 88 books, depending on the tradition. This is a lot more than the 66 books that most people know about. These extra books don't just repeat things or add small details. They have whole stories, laws, prophecies, and histories that aren't found anywhere else. The richness of this text comes from the fact that it keeps stories that show how humans began, how they struggled with their spirituality, and how they interacted with beings that challenged the imagination, like the giants and Nephilim who lived on Earth before the flood. The Ethiopian Bible, on the other hand, keeps a continuous thread of history that lets readers see a world that feels both old and very alive. Western translations often cut out or shorten some parts. There are big differences between the Ethiopian Bible and Western versions. Enoch, Jubilees, and the Book of Adam and Eve are just a few examples of books that tell stories that are missing or very short in more well-known texts. These works elaborate on events that influenced early humanity, encompassing the impact of spiritual entities, the moral degradation of humankind, and the difficulties of existence in a world disrupted by supernatural forces. They give explanations for things that the Western Bible only talks about briefly or in a metaphorical way, filling in the blanks that make people wonder what was lost or left out on purpose. These extra books make the canon longer and more detailed, giving us a unique look at biblical history and a better understanding of the early years of humanity. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church has been very important in keeping these texts safe. For hundreds of years, people carefully copied the manuscripts by hand, kept them safe in monasteries, and passed them down from generation to generation. This cultural dedication makes sure that what we have today is not just a religious text, but also a historical archive that gives us a glimpse into ancient civilizations, religious thought, and the way of thinking of the people who first put these texts together and revered them. The Ethiopian canon stayed very stable, keeping stories that go against common narratives and open doors to hidden histories. This is different from Western traditions that were heavily influenced by theology and politics. The Ethiopian Bible's credibility is linked to the careful research and spiritual dedication that kept it alive through hundreds of years of change and upheaval. The content of these additional books frequently explores domains perceived as taboo or obscure to mainstream audiences. They talk about how people and spiritual beings interacted in ways that make it seem like the world before the flood was much more complicated than most people think. The Book of Enoch tells the story of the Watchers, angels who came down to earth and had children who were giants. The Ethiopian tradition keeps these stories alive with great detail. These texts do not hesitate to examine the ramifications of these unions, the corruption they inflicted upon humanity, the moral decline, and the remarkable abilities possessed by these hybrid entities. These kinds of revelations suggest that Western translators either didn't know about or didn't pay attention to certain information. This gives us a different way to look at the beginnings of human civilization and divine intervention. Many of the stories in the Ethiopian Bible mix history, prophecy, and morality. They tell stories in a way that is rich in detail and makes you think, while also teaching moral and spiritual lessons. The stories about giants, for example, are never just physical descriptions. They also include stories about how people act, how God watches over them, and how the universe works. The Ethiopian canon shows that humanity's past is not just a series of events, but a living story that can help us understand human nature, the effects of choices, and how the spiritual and physical worlds interact. The text serves as both a historical account and a means for contemplation. Numerous scholars examining the Ethiopian Bible assert that its preservation of these texts offers context for certain obscure references in Western scripture. For example, the short mentions of giants and Nephilim in Genesis are expanded upon in great detail. The Ethiopian tradition documents not only their physical characteristics, but also their influence on human societies, the transformations they induced in the moral and spiritual fabric of the world, and the divine reactions to their presence. These stories imply that the giants were not outliers, but pivotal characters in the narrative of humanity's initial conflicts, influencing occurrences that led to the flood. The Western narrative only has pieces of the story without these texts, which means that a lot of it is either not told or not understood. The Ethiopian Bible offers a cultural and historical perspective on early civilizations in addition to its narrative content. It shows how the people who first passed it on saw things, including local histories, oral traditions, and theological insights that were unique to the area. This makes the text a window into a world where geography, society, and spirituality were all connected, and where the effects of beings like the Nephilim could be recorded with care and authority. The way these stories were kept shows that they were not meant to scare or entertain people, but to teach, warn, and guide them. They taught people about the dangers of unchecked power, moral failure, and human responsibility. In a world where divine and earthly forces met, the Ethiopian Bible questions what we think we know about the world before the flood. It makes us question what we think we know about the early history of humans, the interactions between people and supernatural beings, and the size of the events that shaped the ancient earth. The text lets us think about the full range of human experience before the flood by keeping these stories alive. This includes not only survival, but also the moral, spiritual, and social struggles that characterized a time when giants and other powerful beings ruled the world. The vivid details and deep stories make readers think about a world that is much bigger, stranger, and more complicated than what is usually shown in Western scripture. The Ethiopian Bible is a key to understanding the whole Nephilim story because it keeps hidden histories alive. It sheds light on the reasons for the flood, how bad people are, and how giants shape the world's moral and spiritual landscape. These accounts are not separate. They are linked to other biblical stories, creating a web of historical and theological knowledge that is worth studying closely. The text's depth lets readers see patterns, motivations, and consequences that would otherwise be missed. This shows how ancient history and divine oversight came together long before Noah's Ark carried people through the waters of judgment. In this context, the Ethiopian Bible is not just a religious book. It is also a storehouse of old knowledge that helps us understand what life was like before the flood. Its unique mix of canonical and extra-canonical books makes sure that the stories of giants, Nephilim, and Watchers are preserved in detail. This gives modern readers access to information that was lost or hidden in other traditions. The text gives us a look into a world of huge beings, moral ambiguity, and divine involvement, connecting myth, history, and spiritual thought. By reading these stories, you can learn not only how big the giants were, but also how they changed the course of human history in the early days. Long before the floodwaters covered the earth, the pages of Genesis gave a short but creepy look at beings that went against the natural order. Genesis 6 talks about the Nephilim, the strange children of the sons of God and the daughters of men. The passage is short and almost secretive, but it has caused people to argue, wonder, and be afraid for hundreds of years. Who were these sons of God, and why did they hang out with people? Some people think they are fallen angels, while others think they are descendants of Seth. Everyone agrees, though, that their union produced extraordinary offspring, giants whose presence changed the fabric of human society. The mere mention of the Nephilim in Genesis stirs an unsettling awareness that humanity once coexisted with extraordinarily powerful entities, whose impact would